Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Welcome back. This is part 2 of my conversation with Elizabeth Cotton, author of UberTherapy. Elizabeth is a sociologist, therapist, and longtime labor organizer. And in part 1, we talked about hair and teeth, her name for the vulnerable, shame-prone parts of the self. And we talked about what it was like to bring that part of herself to the book and to these different digital therapy applications. In part 2, we're going to pick up on the bigger story, how austerity politics and platform business models are pushing therapy towards this short-term, measurable care, and how people's data is becoming the product, and how therapists are being pushed into low-paid and insecure work on these platforms. And then we'll come back to the big question. What kind of help are these systems actually built to deliver? And what kind of help do we really need? What is real therapy and how might we protect it? Welcome to part 2. You talk about how this sort of the marketing around these forms of therapy is that they're highly personalized, right? And part of the way that gets set up is that through using your data, they can market to you, exactly what you think you might need or something like that. But that it's actually a really depersonalized form of therapy. That I love the way you say this in the book. The quote is that you can have everything you want as long as it's what you call ICBT light, which you call a cheap and politically convenient model of therapy that defines the problem at the level of the individual and their cognitions and behaviors. So what is it about this particular form of therapy that's becoming ubiquitous, and why is it ubiquitous? Why is it the only form of therapy being offered on these platforms? And how does this form of therapy actually prevent the sort of space that you're talking about from occurring?
I'm going to talk about the UK to answer this question. I think it's still relevant to American audience because it sort of all roads lead to Rome. But in the UK, what we've seen is in the NHS a profound standardization, manualization, and industrialization of therapy since 2008, when NHS talking therapies, it used to be called IAPT, Increased Access to Psychological Therapies, was introduced. And we all got excited about it. More people having therapy for free in the UK. Beautiful thing. Loved it. Next generation of therapists leapt into it. Lots of training was offered and What emerged from it over time, over a long period of time and lots of money, was a very short-term, standardized, solution-focused model of therapy, CBT, increasingly ICBT, but very linked to welfare reform and austerity. It started in 2008, which is where everything started to go really heavily wrong for this generation of users and therapists. And what we saw was a real co-option. In the book, I call it a co-option of mental health services into welfare reform. And the fundamental shift, which we saw right from the beginning, but we just didn't want to understand how important it was for psychotherapy to solve a political and a financial problem. Demand goes up, supply doesn't enough, so we've got to make it cheaper. So it replaced a clinical logic with a financial logic. That sounds very simplistic. It's just a fact. That's what was driving it, was the argument that if 50% of people recover after 6 sessions of CBT light, then 50% of the benefits bill, the welfare benefits bill in this country, will be cut, because you'll have a huge percentage of people who are off sick for mental health problems going back into work. So what happened was that under this logic, work became a health outcome. So the outcome, the measurement of whether we're providing a good service, was how many people can come off benefits and welfare and into employment, regardless of what that employment was. And we had decades in this country of work is good for you mantra, which if you're working as an Uber therapist, you'll know is absolutely untrue. It's disastrous. Every survey I've ever done of therapists in the UK, 70% are depressed and burnt out. And it goes up even higher when you go into these heavily industrialized systems. In a way, it doesn't matter. I suppose that's another argument in Uber therapy, is this isn't about therapy. This is about digital health companies. They're not even digital health companies, just digital companies. This is about making money. This is about cutting state expenditure and increasing economic activity and making money. Partly, some would, at certain points, mainly through datafication, through the amount of data that you could capture from the NHS. So I think the sort of argument about how did this happen was that it happened by stealth. Okay, we didn't know this was the end game. We didn't understand that the shift in logic was going to have such catastrophic effects. And in the book, I talk about one company, which, because I go to all these meetings about psychotherapy and about health and policy meetings, I remember this company in the early days, 15 years ago, became one of the biggest and first digital providers in the NHS, in IAPT. And they started out quite well in that they were just basically offering the same therapy, but online. But over time, they started to really develop the manualized and digitalized services that have now come in. But most importantly, until 5 years ago, this company would literally put on its website and go to conferences and say, we have captured data from 250,000 NHS therapy sessions in order to develop AI tools. They literally had it on their website. So we were incredibly naive in that was considered to be a good thing. No one asked, well, hang on, did anybody give consent? How did that happen? What's the end game of this? What use is that to NHS to have you data mining all of those sessions? Well, now they are in the UK the biggest provider of AI diagnostic tools, both to the public and the private sector, based on a decade's worth of NHS data that no one knew they were capturing. I don't name the company because I don't really want to get sued by them, but this isn't that sophisticated about how this happened. This happened because there was a business intention, a strategic business intention to do that. The other thing that happened in the UK was, and there's a book that's being written by a guy called John Pring, he's a journalist and runs a disability network, really important work called The Department, which came out last year. And I was so grateful to him because he's a brave, brave person, because he, like me, went to all of the meetings, but he names names. And he just said very clearly, again, it's not that sophisticated, but the people that were designing welfare reform in the early years of austerity in the UK government, the policy is who turns up at meetings. And who turned up at those meetings? American private medical insurance companies. So actually, in those policy decision meetings was the presence of private medical insurance companies, and the model conveniently really fits their expansion, which is what's happening here in the UK. We're seeing a rapid emergence of private medical insurance in a way that we've just never had here before. And also the emergence of large-scale platforms providing employee assistance programs, which was always a minority player in this country, but is growing and growing, particularly in the public sector, also in universities and schools, so student assistance programs as well. So we're seeing it actually come to life now, the intentional and huge business expansion of private therapy platforms in this country. But that was determined 15, 20 years ago. It's just we're seeing it now come into action.
It's striking to me, like if you were to think about how to create an AI therapist trained on good therapy data, probably the worst thing you could do is train it on data coming from that's ranked by very questionable recovery endpoints, like you said, that really emphasize whether or not the person can internalize a CBT framework and use that to get themselves back to work, essentially like trying to correct their own thoughts in a way that make them more functional or something. And that is a limited therapy over 6 weeks with therapists operating in ways that minimize the therapeutic relationship so as to minimize dependence, so as to make it easier to terminate after a short period of time, and then give that data to an algorithm to figure out what therapy is, and then unlock that to just go operate on its own with patients. It seems like all of the priors that you're building into that system are actually priming the algorithm to do something very anti-therapeutic, but maybe efficient for the sake of returning people to work for welfare reform or something.
I think on every level, how could this work? There's the big conspiracy theory. I have the conspiracy theory. I was at a lot of those meetings. I can tell you now that really did happen. But in a way, it doesn't matter because it has happened and we can't undo that. I suppose on a very personal level, for people going into a therapeutic system which thinks it's okay to take standardized questionnaires of whose value is hotly contested. At the end of every single session, you've got your lovely little NHS therapist going, is everything okay? So how are we feeling better? And you want, it's so manipulative. And then apparently 50% of people say they're feeling better. And then if you're not, what are you expected to feel about that? I mean, it's total manipulation. It's not a basis for being able to say what you think. I mean, it just seems, for someone like me, it's a non-starter. And I think that's where the damage is that it's not just on the macro level, but it's on the micro level of what does that mean for someone to go into that system being told that this is therapy and then feeling that they're being completely manipulated and either, at best just don't go back, which happens a lot in the NHS, or to feel that you've got to spend your time cooperating with somebody who's fundamentally not able to reach you at a level that is genuine and authentic.
So let's talk a little bit about the conditions of therapists on these platforms and in these systems. So you highlight the precarity of these Uber therapists. You write that these are the growing majority, actually, of mental health practitioners who are working in non-clinical and generic roles that are often unwaged or on low pay. And while there are, of course, bad therapists, you highlight how it's really the working conditions and the systems that these therapy workers are caught up in that produce a really diminished form of therapy. And in some ways, because it produces such a diminished form, it actually creates the conditions under which AI therapy becomes preferable for some consumers. But can you lay out what these working conditions are, what they look like, what's it like to live as a mental health worker who's employed by or within, I guess, one of these platforms?
I'm going to answer it in a more sort of like generalized term, because at the moment in the UK, we don't have a majority of what I would call Uber therapists in the sense of working for one platform company. In the UK, it's very much a kind of portfolio. So people will work for a little bit for a platform, some will work for EAPs, bit of part-time work, bit of private practice. But I call it the therapy factory because we've entered into a kind of industrial model of precarity. When I talk about Uber therapists, I'm really talking about entering into this very grey world of insecure work, of intense work, because there's an intensification which is built into working in the gig economy. You've got to take every gig. You're never sure about who's going to come and who's going to go. There's no long-term perspective within this industrial model. And I did a survey in 2019 looking at NHS workers. It was looking at lots of different sectors, but the striking stuff was about this very intense CBT light model in the NHS. And it was the first time, it's been quite difficult to get it published, but we're nearly there now because it's very critical. One of the sort of stark statistics was that 44% of people working within the NHS, both part-time, self-employed, lots of different sort of contractual arrangements, 44% said that they'd been asked to manipulate performance data. So there was a loss of integrity, which came from working within this system of gaming data, which was introduced. Also, 70% said that they were burnt out as a result of their work, of this form of work. So you've got 70% burnt out, 44% who'd been directly asked to manipulate performance data. And yet, I think it was 62% said they felt they were providing good care. And this figure blew my mind. It was like, oh, it just doesn't add up for me. And I thought about it long and hard. And part of me took on the bad therapist, was just like, you're delusional. How can you say that you're 70% burnt, you're working and you're burnt out, you're gaming your performance data. How is that good care? But of course, therapists are therapists. And they work within these systems to the best of their abilities. Most of them do until they can't anymore. And then they have to go and find other things. And then lots of people choose to work part-time as a way of managing the stress of this work and this system and will lose money as a result. But it really made me think very hard about the complexity for therapists as opposed to Uber drivers in the dilemma that you're faced with. You're faced with a constant demand to self-harm and to compensate for a system through your own energy, diligence, professionalism. Again, I don't want to add to the denigration of Uber therapists. I think it's a bad situation that we must understand. And therapists are going to be asked to be discerning about how and where they work, about whether the cost of that, whether it's worth for them the ethical compromise, the professional compromise, and the compromise on their own mental health of working under these tensions. I don't advise people ever to walk out of work if they haven't got an alternative. I don't advise people to do anything that's going to make their situation any more insecure. But this book is an invitation to think about the consequences of this over the long term. The fact is, this is an unsustainable professional model for most therapists already. People duck and dive and do what they can, but actually over the long term, this is becoming the dominant model within the therapeutic profession. So it is important for us to recognize it for what it is and make those strategic choices. And of course, a lot of people are moving out of therapy. A lot of people don't earn their primary, in this country, don't earn their primary income from therapeutic work. They'll have other jobs like being in higher education, being a teacher, what have you. I think there's a real problem I talk about it again in the book, which is quite provocative, around professionalism and around the huge difficulty in the therapy profession to talk about class and privilege and talk about money. And in the book, I use a psychoanalyst, Sally Weintraub's term. She uses it around climate change called Noah's Arkism, which is this idea that, still enough people are privileged enough to think that they've got a place on the boat so they don't have to worry or think about the animals that don't. And in the book, chapter entitled "Do You Have to Marry a Rich Man to Be a Therapist?" I talk about this sort of professional architecture, which is really failing to address this. I call it a 17th century French court, where there is a refusal to confront class and privilege in the profession, right throughout the food chain in terms of training and accreditation and all of that machinery. And it forms what I call a culture of professional cannibalism. So we eat each other. And in the UK, we're going through a process of regulation. We're so far behind the US in terms of professional regulation, but actually doing a really bad job of it in the sense that we're setting up a really distinct and inefficient and counterproductive class system within the profession. Maria Albertson, who ran Counsellors Together UK, who's like a Linda Michaels counterpart in the UK, she was part of the digital therapy project. She ran the largest working class network called Counsellors Together UK. Sorry, my voice is emotional because she was a good friend of mine. She died a year ago, too young. And our professional culture is at a huge loss as a result of her dying because C2UK went with her. The people didn't and the ambition didn't, but she was a huge driving force in raising questions about what is the profession going to do to defend itself. And she and I did lots of research projects around the financial landscape. It was really difficult to get people to talk about money. And we used this provocative statistic that 4% of therapists in the UK use food banks, just not earning enough to eat. And whether it should matter to you as a consumer of therapists, whether your therapist use a food bank. But without the political engagement of the key actors, this isn't going to get any traction at all. So I suppose what I am aware of is how weak we are, again, with political leadership on this issue within the profession. It may be that the political leadership will come outside of the profession. Maybe we'll join the the Uber drivers union. Maybe we'll have to find other political spaces to really collectivize on this. I think that what Uber therapy does is really challenge the defense of the profession to think about class and privilege and money. In Uber therapy, it's not just that I don't think we have a place on the boat. I think what Uber therapy says, there is no boat.
There's already this sort of class system, right? Like ICBT light, digital therapy for the masses, maybe depth psychotherapy for people who can private pay and can pay at such a rate that those therapists can afford to stay outside of these insurance and digital platform systems. But that would be a small boat in this economy in terms of who can access that and who can provide it. I want to move to you hit this existential register, and you've talked about it a little bit already in the book, but I found so compelling.
I don't know why. I haven't worked out a way of not apologizing for that. I've been apologizing it for the whole life. But we are therapists, so we can afford to stare into the abyss a little bit.
Yeah. And you do this with larger existential sort of like cultural critique, and you've mentioned the defense against thinking that this is a part of. Actually, let me read from your book because I think it really hits you in the gut here. Then this is the emphasis is that this larger apparatus of Uber therapy is one of the ways that our cultural moment, the way our society is structured at this moment, prevents us from thinking about each other and the messy parts of being human. So you say, quote, therapists will become just the people behind the platforms, the click workers surviving on predatory prices and wage theft. You will pay a dynamic price, unsustainably low, but seduced by the offer of avoiding a day spent haggling with your insurance company. If you can live with the guilty secret that your affordable therapy is likely to pay your therapist below minimum wage. The demand for continuous growth in the platform economy will in turn influence the nature of the therapeutic relationship where patients become homo consumens, quoting Fromm, demanding a restless and insecure and ultimately indifferent on-demand consumption of therapy that offers a flight from the facts of life. So what sort of existential avoidance do these platforms offer? What flight from the facts of life? And what does this continual and perhaps even exponential avoidance mean for our future of collective organizing, of political resistance?
Gosh, you see, this is where psychoanalysis for me and the great psychoanalytic writers really are a balm to my soul. Because once you're in this point where you're staring into the abyss, you can't just cheer up. You really have to find a deep solution to it.
I laughed out loud when I read your cheer up love version of therapy from the NHS.
Oh my God. I live in a place where people still say that to each other, and I'm a menopausal woman. I'm just like, God, if you think I'm not angry now, just it's very
Just say
tricky
cheer
in
up
that
love
place.
to me. Yeah.
Yeah, just cheer up. So I used in the book Robert Money Curl's The Facts of Life. It's a book that I read when I was studying as a student in the Tavistock, and when I was desperately trying to find some comfort about being myself and feeling really awkward for seeing everything in such political and existential terms, because therapy can be a very normalizing profession, and our cultures can be terribly normalizing. And I'm the person, I'm hypervigilant. I'm PTSD. I'm like, yeah, but there's something happening over there. Can you get more anxious, please? So Money Curl, I love the confidence and the sort of broad brush. He can talk about the whole world and it makes sense. He talks about the facts of life. And I kind of reframe them a bit. They're sort of like my touchstones, my psychoanalytic touchstones throughout this book of me getting really anxious and upset and staring into the abyss of just, let's pull it back to what is it that we are all dealing with and working with as human beings, what the human condition, so that we're not the center of the universe. We're not the key player. We came from parents who didn't even know who we were. We were created by other beings. We're completely dependent on other people. It is a fact of life, and it is horrific and awful. And most of us would like to avoid that at certain points. And then you die. I mean, in the book, I'm quite playful about the issue of everything going on for as long as you want, do it as long as you want, for as, in whatever way you want. But actually, there are limits and there are huge losses that are never addressed through a consumption model. So it really challenges this idea of consumer king. You can get anything that you want and you can have it right now. And if you don't like it, you can get some other stuff, which is capitalism for you, isn't it? The facts of life, the things that we always have to return to and wrestle to, are fundamentally not going to be satisfied by this model. In other places, I call it psychic Pilates in the book. And I feel that, there are lots of seductions and attractions to having an AI therapist. In the book, I sort of give a little scenario of how comforting to be in a room with your AI analyst who is showing you what you need to see, who is not jarring and who is not challenging and doesn't fall asleep in your sessions unless you want them to. And then you can go on a complete self-righteous rage with them. It helps you to feel that you are in control of something that you are not actually. I suppose that's the sort of the play that we have to be able to get comfortable in talking about, in addition to the idea that free association requires freedom of association, that you should care if your therapist is using a food bank. I mean, if you have an AI analyst, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about if they're okay. And that might be quite nice, actually. That might be quite helpful and quite a sort of playful tool that you could use within the context of therapy. But actually, as human beings, if we want to touch that existential problem, we have to get involved in dependency. We have to get involved in loss. And I would rather navigate that with an empathic therapist person that I have grown to trust and rely on, and that I have the space to learn how to trust and rely on them, than trying to find a quick fix for that.
This is, I think, a good transition to the sort of the real therapy project at the end of the book, because you do offer a roadmap. Thankfully, there's some hope at the end of this revelation, right? Out of this digital therapy hellscape. So can you walk us through what you dub real therapy in the book, and where do you see promising examples of resistance and alternative models right now, whether it's in unions, community projects, small pockets of practice? Where are people pushing back against Uber therapy in their own workplaces, and where might we contribute? Where might we start to try to protect this idea of real therapy?
One of the characteristics of political books, certainly industrial political books, is that you got chapter 6, which is 2 pages of solidarity. Let's just have solidarity. And I really didn't want to do this for this book. I've written those books as well. I've written a lot about solidarity. And in the abstract, it sounds great, but the reality is that even the best activists are burnt out right now. We're all so tired, and we're also resistant to being asked to do yet another thing, comrade. So I spent a lot of time on chapter 6. It's the biggest chapter, and it's the one that I think is the least formed. So in the sense that that's my work in the future, I'll tell you as far as I've got, and then let's see if we can join each other, really. I wrote it as a series of intentions because I think things are changing so rapidly, both politically and institutionally. We're in an age of institutional collapse. People go really fast. I think it's really hard to plan this. I do ultimately think it's about relating. I have sort of 2 personas that I have used in my work around surviving work. So I'm by nature a survivalist, which is, I would say, anti-psychoanalytic. And I call myself Sarah Connor sometimes. I have my Sarah Connor moments, the mum of John Connor in the Terminator movies. I've got everything packed, and I've got guns, and I've got a Jeep and a hideout. And I'm a single parent as well, and I'm often just, my mantra is just don't have a stroke today. I'm at capacity as well. So I recognize that in our profession, a lot of us are middle-aged women. A lot of us are awesome, holding the universe in our bare hands, and we're being denigrated and demeaned, and we're considered invisible and useless in this digital world, which I would obviously contest. So I don't have a kind of, come on, kids, let's just do it response to this. I have a very tired and ancient and feminist response to this question. But I do also have a grown up part of myself, which is, I'm so in awe and admiration for my profession and my colleagues in the therapy world. Of course, there are bad therapists, but I don't even know why I said that actually, because it's not six of one and half a dozen of another. The vast majority of therapists that I know are older, experienced, empathic, overqualified, and remarkable people. I just think it is remarkable what we do and the ethical space that we hold. So I start from that, and I'm always surprised at how many of us feel like we're failing because we are set up for failure in these systems. I would be a really bad Uber therapist. I just couldn't hack it. I just couldn't be nice in that intense way. So my grown-up answer to that question is really to hold the space of self-worth and worth for our profession and hold the authority of our experience, to really put that before us and to prioritize that. So at the very least, it means if you feel you're being denigrated in a professional environment or a work environment, step back, walk away, and don't get busy and try to fix everybody. I know that when I go into hyperactivity, I'm trying to compensate for something that I'm actually really uncomfortable with. So I spell out a list of intentions about our responsibility to hold spaces, to promote thinking on difficult issues in the way that we know how to do it, and to be discerning who we do that with, really is my tagline. But some of the things that the intentions that I address are around the political fault lines, because this isn't just about therapy, this is about politics and it's about our culture. One of them is about defending free speech. I use the example of academia, but particularly in therapeutic research, we got a problem, which is that the critical stuff is hard to publish. So we don't allow those debates. And in the digital therapy sphere, I'm not saying that all the research is bad, or I'm not being critical of any individuals. I'm saying that the financial interests are reflected in what gets published. Let's take that on the chin. And I think that's going to get worse in a world of AI publishing. So the truth is often very hard to find. It means that we have to prioritize lived experience, we have to prioritize service user experience, public interventions, public engagement. We know that the right voices and the experiences are not being heard in this debate. We have to keep going with this. The other issue is around work-related suicide, which in the UK it's not recognised as an actual thing. So it means that it's not monitored, it's not regulated in the way that it should. There's a big fight ahead to really understand the harms of work and the harms of digital work and the algorithmic harms. So, for example, Uber drivers, huge legal cases around material and non-material harms. Therapists will have to engage with that. That will be a big part of my work over the next few years. How do we quantify the algorithmic and AI harms for Uber therapists in the future? We have to really challenge the technology. So particularly around surveillance in psychiatric settings in the UK, there are a number of cases being really poorly handled by the profession. We really need to engage in the harms to service users of the technology. But I suppose the sort of underlying ethos is around free association, requires freedom of association. So allowing our conversations not just to be about technique and different forms of psychotherapy, but really to go for the jugular around money, and working conditions, to allow that to be an accepted part of the professional debates. I think in the formulation of much better help that I use in that chapter, I talk about a digital therapy kite mark as a long-term objective. And in a way, I'm an associate professor for responsible business. I worked in a global trades union in the mining sector. I'm not a great believer in corporate social responsibility. I'm made of harder stuff, but I do think that putting out an intention and planting some flags around a digital therapy kite mark might be a good way of organizing consumers around us collectively setting the parameters of what we find acceptable, what we don't, where the potential harms are, where the risks are, and where the costs of that are. Because what we will certainly see is more consumer pushback in the courts. There will be more cases of harms of digital therapy. That will be played out legally. And running alongside that should be this invitation to enter into a collective and public debate around what would make a good digital therapy intervention. And that has to be held on a cultural level because we can't keep throwing bricks at each other and blaming individuals. We really have to set the parameters of what's worth it. Well, what costs are worth it for this convenience? And if they're not, what would a good model of digital therapy look like?
This is maybe a sort of like a time capsule here at the end, because in the book you talk a number of times about, because Uber therapy is becoming so pervasive, whether you're engaging with it directly or just its influence on the discourse, that we're actually in danger of losing sight of the accumulated wisdom of what is therapy, what therapy could be. You capture it very briefly and beautifully a number of times in the book. Like, what is that? What is good therapy? What is much better help? You mentioned before the sort of a sort of therapy that allows us to feel like other people are worth it, or something. So I wonder if, as we sort of draw to an end here, if you could remind us of maybe what that looks like. What is therapy beyond Uber therapy?
Despite being Sarah Connor, I'm also a complete hippie. And the thing that my interactions with therapy have done and continue to do is just amaze me of the relief of not having to pretend, of not starting from the premise that I don't fit or that I have to fit to someone else or something else or to in my environment. I've been very slow in my life to hear the invitation to be myself or to think that that's a good idea. It's one of the reasons why I write and why I'm funny and why I make such an effort in my relationships. I suppose there's a part of me which thinks there's something really not likable about me. And it wasn't until I was genuinely and often not verbally in the presence of someone who didn't ask me to make them happy or to please them or not be challenging or not be rude and not be hair and teeth, not show them that part of myself, that over time it became possible for me to sit with those parts of myself that I couldn't accept. So, it's not news, but self-acceptance and self-love is the hardest journey. And to just sit with myself as I really am has taken me a whole lifetime. And I couldn't have done that on my own. I just could never have experienced it. And I've had various analysts and therapists who have done it in very different ways and have represented the problem to me in lots of different ways in my lifetime. But what they all have in common is their genuine acceptance of me as I am and a genuine invitation for me to show myself as I am. I didn't know it at the time necessarily, but that's what they taught me, is how to do that. Not actually to worry about recovery or finding a solution to a particular problem. I never was able to articulate what my problem was. I was never that zipped up. I was never that kind of, no, I just want this and I want to do it in 6. I don't recognize that in myself. What I was given was a space of non-judgment. And that's the only way in which I was able to say what I was thinking and what I felt and who I actually am.
Glad that allowed so many parts of you to show up in writing this book and to show up here and talk to us. Well, thank you so much for your wisdom today and for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.